maybe it's time to leave. Yeah, you heard that right. Time to leave. That's kind of the provocative idea we're grappling with today.
It is, yeah, and it's coming from this article we've got titled "The U.S. Economic Crisis: Why Departure Might Be the Best Option for Foreign Americans."
And really dives into some pretty significant economic shifts that are, happening right here, right now.
Right.
And suggesting that, you know, for folks who've made the U.S. their home, but aren't originally from here, heading out might not just be like a possibility, but actually the most sensible path forward at this point.
Yeah, it's a perspective that might catch some people off guard for sure. But when you really start, digging into these economic pressures that the article highlights, it does build a pretty compelling, if unexpected, case.
Yeah, for sure. And that's what we want to do in this deep dive, right?
Yeah, we really want to get under the skin of these economic factors the article's talking about and understand why the source frames leaving the U.S. is potentially the optimal, even advantageous move for foreign Americans in particular.
Yeah, people who are facing these conditions head on. Absolutely.
So, okay, the article kicks off by talking about a domestic dollar shortage.
Right.
And I think that's kind of an interesting phrase because, globally there are plenty of U.S. dollars floating around, right?
Tons, yeah.
But the argument here is that they're not readily accessible within the U.S.
Exactly. Yeah, the availability is the issue.
So I guess, for someone living and working here, what does that actually feel like day to day?
Right. Well, it's interesting, right? Because while other countries might be sitting on these huge dollar reserves, those dollars aren't necessarily directly fueling the American economy, It's kind of like, imagine a store that has a ton of IOUs, but not enough actual cash in the register.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right, right.
So this lack of readily available dollars, domestically, it can put a real squeeze on spending.
Mm-hmm.
Businesses might find it tougher to get loans, and consumers might see their purchasing power, decrease.
Yeah.
Which can then lead to a slowdown in economic activity overall.
And even, I guess, contribute to deflation, right?
Exactly, yeah. Where prices drop, which, on the surface sounds great, but if people start expecting prices to keep falling, they might delay buying things, and that just further dampens demand.
Right, right. Less readily available cash just has a sort of knock-on effect across the whole thing.
Absolutely, yeah. A ripple effect.
And the article also puts, a lot of emphasis on the impact of these high tariffs imposed by the U.S. government.
Yeah.
So how are these tariffs contributing to this picture, particularly for, foreign Americans who are trying to establish themselves here?
Well, when you introduce high tariffs, what you're doing is essentially making imported goods more expensive, right? And so for businesses that rely on those imports,
right,
it can mean much higher costs. And then they have to decide, do they pass those costs on to consumers, or do they kind of absorb it by maybe cutting back on hiring or investment?
Right.
And it's foreign Americans who might be, more involved in international trade or working for companies that are really reliant on these global supply chains.
Right.
They could find themselves in a much more precarious position,
Yeah.
because these tariffs can really disrupt these established economic flows.
Yeah.
And potentially lead to job losses in those sectors that are, most affected.
Right, right.
So it just creates this environment of greater economic uncertainty, which is, not ideal.
Okay, and this is where the article really takes a strong stance. I mean, it doesn't just describe these economic headwinds, right?
Right, yeah.
It argues that for foreign Americans specifically, leaving the U.S. is becoming inevitable. And it even kind of implies that, past financial choices that people have made have contributed to making this the most logical outcome.
Yeah, it definitely pushes that narrative.
So what do you make of this strong departure is best narrative?
What's so fascinating to me is this direct link the article makes between these economic pressures.
Yeah.
And the idea that leaving isn't just a reaction to them, it's almost like a preordained, maybe even beneficial adaptation for foreign Americans.
Interesting.
It's suggesting that the current economic climate in the U.S. is just fundamentally misaligned with the interests and well-being of this particular group.
Mm-hmm.
And that makes relocation a strategically sound decision.
Okay.
And I think, you, listener, you really have to consider this framing. Like, is this just an observation of economic realities, or is there a persuasive element here?
Right.
Is it suggesting that for long-term stability and opportunity, looking beyond the U.S. might actually be the most advantageous choice right now? Right, right.
Given these very specific economic challenges that we're talking about.
Okay, so to bring it together, the article is painting a picture of a U.S. economy that's facing this dollar shortage and also grappling with the effects of these high tariffs.
Right.
And its core argument is that these conditions are making it increasingly clear and maybe even desirable for foreign Americans to consider, their futures elsewhere.
Exactly. The source material is really presenting a scenario where the economic landscape of the U.S., it's shifting in a way that disadvantages foreign
Yeah.
Americans.
Yeah.
It positions departure as this rational and maybe even empowering response
Yeah.
to these evolving circumstances.
Now, this deep dive has definitely presented a thought-provoking, if unconventional, perspective on the current economic climate
I agree.
and its potential impact, especially on foreign Americans.
And it makes you think, right, what are the implications when economic forces are being portrayed as so strongly favoring such a significant shift in people's lives and where they
Yeah,
choose to live?
the big question.
It's a huge question. Like, what larger global trends, might we be seeing reflected
Yeah.
in this narrative?
Yeah.
And what could be some of the less obvious consequences if significant numbers of people actually do find, their best opportunities outside of the U.S., just as this article is suggesting?
Yeah, and that's really the key takeaway for you listening to consider. Like, if economic conditions are truly making departure a really compelling option for a substantial group of people,
Hmm.
it could point to these much broader shifts in global economic attractiveness and opportunity.
Yeah.
It raises questions about the long-term impacts on the U.S. itself
Okay.
and where these new centers of economic dynamism might emerge.
Right. It's really something to think about. I appreciate you exploring this complex and rather assertive perspective with me.
It's been my pleasure.
And we hope that this deep dive has given you some food for thought on these significant economic trends.
Absolutely. There's a lot to unpack here.
Yeah, for sure.